My name's Jonah Rupe, and I'm here with Camille Stevens-Rumann. Today's August 16th, 2021, and we're on Zoom to talk about the historic 2020 wildfire season. Thanks for meeting with me.
Thanks for having me.
So my first question is, you've been a wildland firefighter, research scientist, and most recently an assistant professor at CSU. And how's the amount of varied work you've done informed your current methods or research strategies?
Yeah, well, I definitely wouldn't be a fire ecologist if I hadn't been a wildland firefighter. So inherently, it has contributed in every way. But it also really helps me, I think about applied research and what kind of research might be more helpful. I think there's a lot of value in basic research, but a lot of the work that I do is very much focused on what does this mean for managers or practitioners that are out there on the ground, either during a fire or after a fire.
Okay. And so how is the role of an ecologist different in a time of such rapid changes to climate and landscape?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an exciting and somewhat sad time to be an ecologist. There are times when, it's really interesting and fascinating to watch these changes happening in real time in many cases. But it's also, I think, difficult to stand on a foundation of, ecological theory that was made maybe 100 years ago that says the world operates in a certain way, which is not how it's currently working. So there's a lot of change and dynamic interactions that I think wouldn't have been foreseen 100 years ago. So that makes it kind of difficult, I think, especially when you want to say like, oh, the world operates exactly like this. That's a lot of what scientists do in general, is try to find the exact answer of how things work. And in ecology in general, that's really difficult because there's always all those other things that matter besides the one factor or the 5 factors that you're looking at. And I think that becomes especially true and even less stable with climate change and human intervention and all of the ways that we've been impacting landscapes.
So then do you feel like an important part of your job is staying up to date on the current research other people are doing?
Definitely, yeah. I mean, I think that's important for all scientists to spend a good amount of time reading literature, both so that you understand what other people are finding, and also that helps you get the good ideas to see what other people are doing and enjoying and finding, for sure.
So this brings me to my next question. In an interview with Science Friday I saw online, you mentioned the need to, quote, think about how we manage lands after a wildfire. So I was wondering what you think post-fire management should look like.
Yeah, well, I guess to lay the groundwork, there are a lot of ways that we manage landscapes post-fire. The first way, like we've seen in Colorado this year, is trying to keep those hillsides stable so that they don't wash over I-70 or down the Poudre Canyon. And so there's a lot, in that very first year after a fire, hillside stabilization and, looking at a lot of watershed management. And then after that, from 1 to 20 plus years post-fire, there's a lot of planting and dealing with fuels and different things like that go on. And, I think historically, right, the Forest Service has a mandate to reforest every acre that becomes unforested. We obviously don't have the budget to do that, especially when you talk about a single year that burns 10 million acres. And in some cases, that's kind of good because not all of those acres need to be reforested by people, right? It's happening naturally. Trees come back really great. I've been in some parts of the 2020 fires already, and there's like a carpet of dense, regeneration already happening. So there's lots of places like that. But then I think the you know, where we need to get better at managing those post-fire landscapes is where we do need to do something. And both deciding what to do as well as identifying where we do something at all can be difficult because, you know, if you don't see it this year, does it not mean that you won't see it ever, you know, a tree coming back? Or is it just like, oh, they'll start coming in next year? So it becomes difficult to kind of prioritize where to plant. And then we've also done, you know, historically a lot of planting kind of trees in lines, in rows, kind of like a plantation. And we know the forests don't look like that naturally. And usually that requires some additional intervention to thin out that forest as those trees get taller. And the reality is, again, we don't have the funding often to do that effort. And so I think that's another thing that a lot of people have advocated for recently is planting with the intention of this is what you want the forest to look like, and let's mix up how they're arranged and not plant them as densely so that we don't have to worry about going back in later. Yeah, so there's a lot, I mean, there's just a lot of things to think about, I think, in that post-fire landscape. And we've spent, because we haven't had big fires for so long, or, you know, not as many, we haven't spent a lot of time focusing on that part of forest management. We spend a lot more time working in green forests than we do in black forests. And unfortunately, probably we're going to be transitioning to having to learn how to manage those black forests again.
So I've heard a lot of invasive species are moving in after a fire because they're better adapted to the new landscape. And so do you think to manage fire resistance, it's important to sort of let that happen and let the species that know what they're doing move in? Or should we try to like change things back to the way they were?
Yeah, well, I think, you know, invasive species is always a concern with a disturbed area, whether that's a treatment or a fire. And so that's definitely something to watch and be careful for. I think there's a difference between, you know, having a full landscape of something like cheatgrass that's really highly invasive and non-native versus like a species just moving kind of up the hillside, so to speak, that may not have been found on that specific location before, but is still native to Colorado. And to me, that latter option of just like a non-native to that specific site is not detrimental. You know, in many ways, it's our landscapes and ecosystems reorganizing in the way that's going to work the best for those landscapes. And I think with climate change, we can probably fairly definitively say that we're not going to be able to go back to what those places were pre-fire in all cases. Certainly some places will continue to be a ponderosa pine forest or whatever, but not, there's a lot of places that I think are going to become unsuitable to the forests that were there previously.
Yeah, and just this week, actually, we've been dealing with a lot of smoke. I think maybe it was earlier this week, but Denver's air quality was the worst in the entire world.
I know, I saw that.
Yeah. So seems like now's the time to do prescribed burns, but also it's a time when people are probably resistant to, you know, more smoke. So how do you think we inform communities or convince them, I guess, to tell them about prescribed fire?
Yeah. Well, I have a very blunt colleague in the fire world that says, how would you like your smoke? Do you want it in small bits with prescribed fire, or, you know, for us to just sit in that haze for weeks and weeks at a time? And I think, unfortunately, that's kind of, that message has definitely been driven home to me over the last year with like all the fires last fall and just sitting in this huge, you know, it felt like Mordor in some ways for a few days, and or really a couple months maybe. And I think that's one of the messages that we probably have to drive home, is that smoke is going to be a part of our lives as our climate warms, as these forests burn. And it's kind of up to us to choose whether they burn catastrophically in these, you know, 500,000 acre fires like California is having, or if it burns in, you know, 51,000 acre fires. over with prescribed fires. And I think that's, I don't think we're really going to move away from one of those two options.
So how is like Colorado's wildfire situation comparable to other states, or how is it unique maybe?
Yeah. Well, before 2020, I think Colorado has gotten away with not having as many big fires as a lot of other Western states. You know, if you look at the largest fires in other Western states like Idaho or Montana or even Wyoming, their largest fires are much bigger than the ones that we saw or we have generally seen, right? We had the Hayman fire certainly, and that was a very large fire. But then after that, you know, if you look at like the top 10 fires before last year, they drop off pretty quickly, and there's not a ton of really large fires. And so I think in some ways we had become somewhat complacent in that, like, even though we know fires could happen, as a state, we've been fairly resistant to prescribed fires because of some lost prescribed fires earlier in the 2000s. And so we just really have avoided it and tried to, you know, pretend that we don't have a potential fire problem in a lot of ways. And I think 2020 was a crazy year for Colorado and many other states. And so that was it, you know, kind of our uniting thing is that multiple states had really bad fire years. And I think we got lucky in many ways with how few fatalities there were. And, you know, especially with these really quick moving fires. And I think that was kind of something that was really shocking for me and others in fire science of, like, you know, when you're talking about a fire moving 6,000 acres an hour overnight over the Continental Divide, all three of those things are like almost unheard of. You know, there's only been a couple other fires that we know of in history that have crossed the Continental Divide. That rate of spread is really rare. And so it's, you know, I think in that way, we got the brunt of the worst of those fires and how they and how they burned across Colorado, and just like the extent of all across the Front Range, but other areas in Colorado too. It's kind of hard to remember that we had the Pine Gulch fire over by Grand Junction way before any of these other fires got going. So it's been, it was kind of an interesting year. And I think the last thing I would say that makes it unique a little bit here is that we're really not used to having fall fires. You know, we have snow, and usually that puts out a fire. Yet we had, you know, the Cameron Peak fire didn't stop burning, or wasn't officially out and contained until the beginning of December, which is really late for us. And I think that is one of those examples of the impact of climate change, that we don't have those snow fire ending events as frequently and as sustained. You know, it didn't stay cool enough for that snow to sit there for long enough for the fire to be put out.
So then, is this like the new normal? Are we going to see big fires every summer?
Yeah, I mean, right. It's one of those things that, are we going to see huge fires every summer? Probably not. Are we going to see more summers like 2020? Probably. Right. Again, this year we've been pretty good so far. Knock on all the woods in your house. But we have been wet enough this year that we haven't seen a lot of large fires, and I think it's somewhat of a cyclical pattern for that to happen. But all of the climate data would show us that we are probably moving to having conditions that were more similar to last year more frequently, rather than it being this like crazy one-time event.
So then what about our building patterns? Like, as we move forward, like my house, for instance, has those fire-resistant shingles. But should we be more concerned with you know, more houses being built out in rural areas?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think there's a lot of things we should be concerned about as we move into that wildland urban interface. Everybody wants their cabin in the woods, but that comes with a certain amount of risk. And as a former firefighter, most firefighting fatalities happen when you're trying to protect a home, because it's pretty easy to walk away if a situation gets too dangerous because of another tree, um, except for maybe some very special trees. But it's not as easy when it's people's homes and livelihoods and things that they really care about. And so I think um, we're asking people as firefighters to put their lives at risk for our enjoyment of nature on the off chance that it doesn't burn. And so I think we've come a long way in advertising. I think people accepting a certain amount of need to make fire resistant homes and do defensible space, but I think a lot more could be done and much larger areas to be treated to really protect those homes and those landscapes. Oh, you're on mute.
Thank you. So then how will those communities we just saw, like Estes Park and Grand Lake, what's the next 10 years going to look like for them? Like, how do they bounce back from this?
Yeah. Grand Lake especially, I think, is a tough one since they had so many structures destroyed. I think in a lot of ways, Estes Park got really lucky, and also the national park, in some ways these fires are a natural process. And so the fact that it happened on a national park provides a lot of good learning opportunities, good opportunities for research to watch what happens. And also just, this is a part of our landscapes. And so I think from a tourist perspective, hopefully we can help sell it that like fire is cool and sometimes in some ways. And we can learn a lot from it. But I think when you talk about a whole community that's really been impacted, it is much, much harder to move past that, right? You can rebuild the homes, but when you are used to a forest being around you that won't be there again, it's really devastating. And there's also issues like we've seen already this year of flooding. So your house may have survived, or you may have rebuilt already from the fire, and now you're facing flooding concerns. And I know that's happened in some of the mountain communities on the Cameron Peak as well, up the Poudre Canyon. And I think I don't have a great stance on how we move forward or rebuild, other than knowing that hopefully those communities themselves are really strong, and that's kind of how people remain there and stay integrated as a part of that community and learn how to find the value and enjoyment of that landscape, even though it looks really different now. But it is, I think, we're looking at a long recovery process from the human and the natural side in those places.
So then, for you personally, on the background form you turned in, you said you've come to a point where you think you can't be objective, or you shouldn't be completely objective, because you're talking about human concerns and with land management. So could you maybe tell us more about that?
Yeah, well, I think, right, when I first got into science, and a lot of how we think about science is we think about us being these like empirical people that just stand above anybody's without our own personal values set upon the landscape, or things that we care about out there. And I'm not saying that I therefore change what my data looks like or something like that, but rather I think when it comes to talking about the implications of the work is where I don't think I'm at a place that I can still just present data and not say like we should do this, or if like we want to continue to have forests with climate change, that we should just I feel obligated to advocate, I think, a little bit more than I did previously. And I think part of what has spurred that is just living through these fires that we have, seeing these landscapes that have changed so much. We're not really in a place that we can just sit on the sidelines and allow others to make their own judgments on what the science says, right? We're at a point that I think we have to share how we feel like we should go forward. And so, that's things like when I talk to communities, well, if you want trees here and it's getting too hot for the trees that were here before the fire, what do we do? What tree species do we try? And I think it's those kind of conversations that I'm not trying to necessarily put my value on it, but acknowledging that these places are changing a lot and really rapidly. And so if you have a specific value, like having a forest or protecting a watershed, then I think we are at a point that we need to start thinking more creatively on how to manage that, and not just do what we have for the last 40 years.
So then, sounds like community involvement is a big piece of prevention and mitigation.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, part of my job is as the assistant director for the Colorado Forest Restoration Institute as well. And that is kind of a bridging organization with the mission of sharing science with managers. And I think that, to me, a manager is anybody who has a stake in the land, not just like a person sitting in a Forest Service office, but if you have your own property in that area or you have some stake in that community, you are inherently a manager because you have a desire to see an ecosystem in a certain light. And I think we can't do actionable science without without community involvement, because otherwise we're operating up here, but maybe everybody else wants us to be way over here on a totally different field, and so we have to do it together.
So about 60% of Colorado is privately owned, and then the other 40% of our land is public. And so do you see management concerns being different on those two types of land? Like, is one more concerning than the other inherently?
I don't think one is more concerning than another. They do have different, I think, types of concerns sometimes. I mean, I think a lot of management occurs on public land is to protect communities. That's where the vast majority of money goes to for treatments on the Forest Service or Forest Service or BLM side is near homes and communities. So in that way, they're the same, right? They're trying to protect. But I think there is some different issues, such as thinking about, well, is a specific treatment going to be ecologically sound? And I have less concern about the ecological soundness of a treatment if it's on somebody's private property and they're trying to protect their home. But if you're talking about in the middle of a national forest, then to me, it doesn't make sense to do those same types of things if they're not in line with the ecology of that forest.
So then what, I mean, a lot of your job now is seeing things getting destroyed and sort of trying to rebuild from that. So, I mean, how do you keep yourself going personally? That sounds kind of hard.
Yeah. Well, first, I don't like to think about fire as destroying places, and I say that from as an ecologist trying to separate myself from the human destruction element or human values destruction. But there is a lot of beauty, I think, in fire and burn landscapes as well. And so, yeah, some of it, especially when it's places that I know, right? Like the fires from 2020, I spent lots of time now in those landscapes before the fire. It's hard to be there and not acknowledge the amount of change that's happened because of a fire. But I think there's also a lot of beauty in the restarting of those forests and those ecosystems, and like how potentially resilient our landscapes are, because you walk in there And almost every place that I have looked at from 2020, there's already plants growing, in the 10th acre. Maybe it's not a ton of plants yet, but there still are some. And to me, that gives me hope that these places, these places still have value, which I think is something that if you're feeling the sadness of those fires, it's hard to see that the cool things that are going on in there and the value in them. And I personally feel like there can be a lot of really important value. And it changes what your hike looks like. You don't necessarily want to hike through a burnt forest at 5 o'clock in the afternoon on July 20th or something like that, but it's going to be way hotter than it was last year at that time. But it does have a lot of really cool things going on in it, and that's kind of how I try to approach it, and try to find those cool things that are going on.
So then, do we see a reduction in biodiversity in these burned areas, like long term?
Yeah, not necessarily. There are, right, when you lose the trees, that's only one species usually, or here maybe in a certain forest you might have up to like 4 or 5 species in a stand. In Colorado, we don't have super diverse tree species. You open up the understory that's full of diversity. And so usually you actually, in terms of like sheer numbers, you might end up with more species, or at least a larger cover of a larger number of species in the moderate time periods. And there's some interesting work on that from the Hayman fire, actually, where this Paula Fornwalt, who's at the Rocky Mountain Research Station, did some work where she looked at whole plant communities right after the fire and through time. And it came out that, you see a lot of different species come in and out of those, early post-fire periods, and then they kind of stabilize a little bit about 5 years post-fire. But they're still really diverse, even compared to maybe what they were before the fire. So you're not necessarily losing diversity, just losing what that structure of that ecosystem looks like, maybe.
So then, what about educating people on these issues? I know you've done a lot of work on that personally, but do you think who do you think should do that? Like who should be the one to have these conversations with people, and how should they try and reach them?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's our job as applied scientists to get better at communicating our science to people. I think that's probably my number one thing, is that, I can write all the papers in the world that sit on somewhere in the internet ether, and the 5 other people that write on that same topic will read. So I think better outreach from scientists. I think we also have a really large wealth of educated people who work for our land management agencies. And I think sometimes we have to work better at bridging that gap between what an institution is doing, like the Forest Service, or, I'm not trying to call them out specifically, but any large land management agency is doing, and how that's communicated to the public. Because I think, almost every manager I've ever talked to wants to do good work that does a lot of ecological benefit. They're not out there to cut down trees and take the money value out of these places for the most part. And so I think that's a big part of the communication. And then, I think one of the things we're definitely combating here in Colorado is that we have a whole bunch of new people moving into the state weekly, daily, and a lot of those people may not be as informed about our landscapes as you or I, who've lived here a few years, or someone else who's maybe been here for their whole life. And I think that, some of that education relies on that neighbor to neighbor communication, right? Or your coworker or something like that. And not saying you have to, everybody who listens to this needs to go out on an education campaign to do more prescribed fires or something, but I think that there's a lot of value in just talking to the people who are in your networks about how special these ecosystems are and what the challenges are that they face.
Oh, bless you. So, you mentioned how there's sort of like a divide between, institutions and then communities at times. And are you maybe seeing more of that now, since there's, I'd say, a pretty noticeable distrust of science in a lot of places surrounding COVID, climate change, anything like that? Does that make it harder?
Yeah, certainly. I think the issues with climate change and the distrust of scientists around climate research, it has made it more difficult uh, to make actionable change, I guess, maybe in the way ecosystems are managed. I think we've made some strides forward with that, and that at least the federal land managers can say those words again, which they were not allowed to say during the last administration. But I think, kind of the uniting thing about fire is that if you see these large fires happen, it doesn't matter where you are in a political spectrum or a belief in science spectrum, you're still being faced with these sitting in smoke for days, or neighbors' homes burning down, or whatever it is. And there's no denying that, right? There's no denying that force. And I think that kind of helps overcome some of that challenge, and at least addressing that this is a problem. I think the solutions that different people might come up with are varied, and that gets to your earlier question on like, how do you overcome the lack of desire to sit in more smoke, or the distrust of doing prescribed fires, because that's a big problem too. We are concerned that prescribed fires are going to result in houses lost or evacuations and things like that. And I think some of that is just the more time we have, and the more communication we can and trust we can build at a really local scale is how that's going to be overcome. And I think in Colorado, actually, we've done a really great job at trying to address some of these problems. I don't know what the numbers are, but certainly more than any place else I've ever worked, the collaborative groups are really strong here, and have a lot of community buy-in and conversations going on about how to manage their local forests, what kind of work needs to be done, creating priorities. And to me, that's how the best science happens, is through those collaborative processes.
So, is like the role of water or the need for water different now? Do we need to think more seriously about how we store it and manage it?
Yeah, I don't feel like I'm best qualified to talk about this because I'm not a huge water person, but I would say, there's a lot right now of challenges going on with like the Colorado River being at the lowest level it's been since the dams were built. And there's certainly many issues that we've had and are having with these fires and flooding events, as well as sediment flows into our watersheds that treatment plants can't deal with effectively. And that's, this is a problem that's prominent in all Western states, these water limited places. But I think Colorado is even, more unique in some ways than other places in this concern, because we have all of our population centers at the bottom of the mountain wanting that water to come down to us. So it's really difficult to manage it, I think. And a lot of the water utility companies, that of, like Denver Water, spends a lot of money trying to protect forests and puts a lot of money into forest management. which I haven't, again, this is my limited experience in this field, but I haven't seen as much involvement of water suppliers in other states when it comes to fire and forest management.
Why do you think that is? What are we doing differently?
Yeah, I mean, I think again, it's because we have these big population centers that have reservoirs, 100 miles away or 50 miles away at the top of the mountain, and you need that water to be clean when it comes into the city. And we've set up a system to protect and conserve that water really strategically along our mountains, and that. But for them to be useful and usable, can't be running off burned hillsides. So there's at least more action being done by those providers to protect those areas.
Yeah, thank you. I'm all out of questions now. So thanks very much for all your time. Sorry, there's a way you gotta end the recording. Okay. I'm gonna stop recording now.